I am the son of Louis Karol, as well as being an architect and a historian. I entitled the talk an immigrant's tale because I felt that that really encapsulated many of my father's values. You know, I was at one point going to use the title, you know, that had been used in various articles, The Architect Who Built Cape Town. Then I decided that was probably too pretentious. And I also thought of the idea of a son's view, but I think that sounded a little bit too much like Nathaniel Kahn's film about his father, Lou Kahn. And of course, unlike my father, unlike Lou Kahn, my father was a fantastic family man and a faithful husband, and I'm not an illegitimate son like Nathaniel. So I thought I'll concentrate rather on the notion of the immigrant, of the desire to fit in and the desire to succeed. And I speak about Louis Karol, and I think when I speak about the firm or the practice, Louis Karol, in many ways, I'm speaking about the 1,000 people who worked for the firm over a period of some 65 years. And, you know, it's something that my father always stressed, that this practice was a collaborative practice. And I think that that's a very important view to stress and care of, you know, people ranging from those from the very early years to the later years at the office. I mean, in many ways, my father, particularly in the later years, was best known for the work that the firm did at the waterfront, and of course being the lead managing architect of Cape Town Stadium, which was designed by GMP and ourselves together with Point put the job together, or to go to the work that he did in the 1970s. And I show here Riebeck Street, which is running, over here. And during the 70s, you know, in a period in Riebeck Street, he did the firm did over 6 buildings. But I'd really like, I think it's in the words of Maria from Sound of Music, let's start at the very beginning. And to me, the very beginning starts in Lithuania, in the Baltic states, in what was really then the Russian Empire. My grandfather, great uncle, great grandfather were master craftsmen who worked for the Baltic Germans who'd moved into the Baltic states, and they would spend anything from 3 to 6 months on a manor house like this, doing Spanish plaster, murals, etc., etc. However, things went wrong when, during the Great War. 2 things happened. One, the Russians were worried that the Jews in Lithuania were going to side with the Germans, and they expelled the Jews into the Ukraine. And obviously there was no major craftsmanship to be done there. And interestingly, there's an architect in Johannesburg, Ross Marin, and it's from his family that we bought the sausage recipe. And we became sausage manufacturers and sellers during those years of the Great War in the Ukraine. After the war, of course, the barons had all disappeared. And my grandfather then did 2 things. He bought a farm, not a good idea. We weren't really farming people. But then he decided that the family needs to move to Southern Africa. And this is the customs declaration from 1927, basically stating that my grandfather, Elijah Karol, Zalman Elijah Karol, has no debts, and he's living in Pikelheim, which is in the area of Shadik. And I think the reason he moved to Keetmanshoop in what had been German Southwest Africa and was then Southwest, where he joined his brother. I think he went there in 27 because they had just built a synagogue in Keetmanshoop. He left behind his father, whose name was Yitzhak Zvi Hirsch, and the family. And this is my father sitting on a horse on the farm. I think this was probably the only time my father was ever on horseback. His brother, Abraham Michael, the sisters, and his mother. And I think my grandfather saw the future in South Africa, and it's always said that my grandmother, Genya Mechler, she had a premonition of something bad happening in Europe. And in 1936, they got aboard the Dulio, and they moved out to South Africa. Now, of course, in architectural terms, the Dulio was already famous because in 1934, late 1933, Martiensen had traveled on the Dulio to Europe on the famous trip where he met Le Corbusier on January 4th, 1934, which was also my mother's 4th birthday. And my father gets to South Africa. He's age 8. His name is Lebas, which comes from the Yiddish of Leib. His Hebrew name was Aryeh Leib. He would then become Louis, even though a couple of years earlier, when they'd applied for permission to go to Southwest Africa, he was known as Leopold. And what's interesting here is it says he cannot write. He would, of course, say his writing never got strong. And age 8, speaking absolutely no English, only speaking Yiddish, he went off to school. And here is his standard 1 report from 1937. And I shall read from it. Louis still finds it difficult to follow in class. He must try harder, underlined in red, and study his spelling words and tables at home. He is very weak in dictation. Fortunately, it took him a year, and this is standard 2. There are now 28 children in the class, and he came first. So he was obviously getting the feeling of academia. And age 15, he decided that the family should move to Muizenberg. Muizenberg at that point was in its heyday, and he felt if they built a house, if they bought a house, they could run it as a boarding house. I suppose we'd now say it was a B&B, and the family could live for free, so to speak, during the season and make some money. And I think it was really in these years that he came into his own. He went to Cape Town High, which, like Sachs, was a free school, but Cape Town High had less demands in terms of uniforms, sports, etc. So it was a school that the less well-to-do immigrants went to. But in spite of that, and in spite of it being a failing school at the time, there were 17 of them in matric, and of them, 1 became an opera singer, a Rhodes Scholar, a physicist, a rabbi, and my father. And he got a very good matric. Obviously, he had gotten better at dictation. And the thing that always interests me is this notion of my father's English. And I'm just finishing reading the book on Bernard Klein. And his daughter always refers to how she never heard Bernard's accent, even though, he had come from Central Europe. And I was discussing this the other day with my sister Simone, and I think we've never heard the accent, but he obviously always maintained that immigrant's accent, whereas to us, it sounds like, BBC English. So below is a view of Muizenberg, the old pavilion in its heyday, and the Balmoral Hotel, one of the posher hotels, designed by Lieb and Honigman. So he finishes matric, one of the top students, and in 1947, he enters UCT. I think feeling a little bit all at sea, so to speak. There were a lot of ex-servicemen, all in their heavy boots, heavy drinking, heavy smoking, and sexually active, who he said he felt always very uncomfortable with. And also, many of these chaps had originally intended to do engineering and had failed out of engineering into architecture. There was only 1 woman in the class, and that was Romana Kabion, who's Anna Longrig's mother, if I'm not mistaken. And I think the professors always felt that, having one woman in the class would tone the lads down slightly. So to give the context of architectural school in 1947, the professor was Thornton White. He had arrived in South Africa in 1936. And it must be remembered, of course, that he got the post rather than Martiansen. And I think he felt he was a tamer and safer bet. And he was a very tentative modernist. And the house on the left is his own house, Green Gables. And you can see the influence of it on our own house and of houses across Cape Town. In terms of the other faculty, and I'm most grateful to Darryl Price-Lewis, the nephew of Professor Price-Lewis, for sharing this page from the notebook. And my father says that, he was always in absolute awe and fear of Price-Lewis, who used to come in and draw a center line on the blackboard in chalk, and then these beautiful drawings just sort of exploded from his hand. And I think that's the way history of architecture was seen. Remember the buildings and be able to draw them. And I think for that reason, my father always had a certain aversion to architectural history. In addition to that, there was Stubbs teaching theory of structures. And the only, I think the only real guide in the faculty was Mr. Parsons, who was the janitor, who, even though he was merely a janitor, he understood Thornton White's mind. And when he had to pin up the work, he pinned it up in the order that he thought Thornton White would mark it, and he was usually correct. And, that was the school. Of course, I think, because he was always an Orthodox Jew and kept the Sabbath, so never spent the Friday nights and the Saturdays socializing. And as he said, he was also a very shy young man. So as such, the two great stars of the older students were Barry Bierman, who in 49 had gone to Brazil, and Jack Barnett, who in 48 had gone to America and then became a Rome scholar. I don't think he really had any contact with them during those years. The thing that he did take away was a love of Frank Lloyd Wright. But in his fourth year, he started practice. Here he is at his board. He would point out that at that point his nose was perfect before it was ruined by a very bad doctor in Johannesburg. And in fourth year, he began his first house in Camps Bay. As he said, there were enormous problems with the contractor going bankrupt, and he used to ask an enormous number of questions of Dougie Andrews, who was teaching professional practice. Andrews, I think, just thought he was a very interested young student. My father said he had to get the answers, so he knew what to tell everybody on site. And then during his practice continued, that job actually then got stopped slightly, but he had other blocks of flats in Lakeside, which he never even told me where they were. He worked on them because he was busy doing his thesis. He hired two slightly younger students. Both went on to become great architects in Cape Town, Mike Munich and Dirk Visser. And he paid the two of them £20 each. And my father was living still in Muizenberg in those days. And I said to him, well, Dad, did they work at their house and bring you out the drawings? And he said, absolutely not. I had them, schlep out to Muizenberg every day so I could see what they were doing. And I kept thinking of this in terms of what we're seeing at the moment with work from home. Just don't really think it's a concept that would have gone down very well with my father. But when he graduated, he got his first job, and you always need a patron. And his patron was my late uncle, his brother, Abraham Michael Karol. And my uncle convinced the Weinberg Synagogue that my father was a highly experienced architect and they should commission him. They obviously realized how young he was. They turned to Alfred Honigman and said, what would you do? And Honigman basically sketched the same solution as my father. So he said, all good, you've got the job. And he got a lovely 6% fee of £12,000. So he got £720. It was on the basis of that, and while this job had been stopped, he had worked for 6 weeks for Kantorovich, Roy Kantorovich and Hope. And I said, did you come away with anything from those 6 weeks? He said, no, except for the outstanding detailing. And once he had the practice established, he decided it was time to get married. Now, he met my mother 5 years earlier. She had come down to Cape Town to be with a friend. The friend had gone off to a Jewish holiday camp. The friend turned to my father and said, look after this woman, please. And of course, my father was looking after the woman until the day he died. And, my father, when they met, said, that he wanted to marry her, but he couldn't. And would she wait for him, 5 years until he graduated and established a practice? And that's exactly what happened. My mother said there was never a proposal. It was just my father informing her that this is what was going to happen. And these are photographs from her coming down to the graduation, the wedding, and the young architect and his wife walking in town. A bit embarrassed that my father hasn't got a jacket on, but these things do happen. My mother worked briefly for my father, and this striking young woman used to do the council submissions. And she just went along and found somebody responsible to make all the changes and okay the drawings. And my father said, no, you're supposed to submit it. They tell us what to do. You bring it back. And she said, but this is far more efficient that the head of building survey just makes the changes there and signs it off. But I think it was bringing the dog to work that stopped my father having her. But the important thing, and this is something my father always stressed, this was his most important partner in the success of the practice. Because without my mother raising us children, which she obviously did perfectly, when I look at myself, and he wouldn't have been able to concentrate on the office the way he did and work the sort of hours that he did. And fortunately, practice picked up in the 50s, in spite of there being a recession in 1956, the first of many that the practice would envisage. My father always told this interesting story. People couldn't get bonds and they didn't have money. And he went to see Mrs. Levine, who he was doing a job for, a fairly largest job for that period. And he turned to Mrs. Levine and said, Mrs. Levine, will you pay me? And Mrs. Levine turned to him and said, you see, my daughter could have married many successful men, but she's married a picture. The man's got no substance. I have to pay to put a frame around the picture. What could my father say? He admitted that he wasn't going to get fees. But fortunately, by 1959, things were going well. He bought a small plot, 1.5 miles from synagogue, so walkable, along the Riverside Road, along the banks of the Liesbeck, and the little sketch of how you get there, Boshoff Gates, you go down Boshoff Avenue, and of course, the lovely Harvey Fagan house is here, and you turn into Garden Street. Very proudly, the house was published in The Architect and Builder, and the rather fabulous curtains that we had when I was growing up, and the copper fireplace. Interestingly, at the beginning, my father wanted more and more open spaces, and you can see that there was glass through to his study, and there was glass through to the stoop. And I think, fortunately, my mother put her foot down and said, no, we're going to make rooms and not spaces. And I think that's one of the reasons that the house is still there and my mother and my sister still live there, because it's an easily livable house, because we had rooms, not spaces. Of course, one can see the influence very clearly of Frank Lloyd Wright in the house. And this was my father's study, where every night when he came in from work and he had his dinner, he went upstairs to the study, usually put on Harry Belafonte, and he just sat and drew, and very often with staff from the office. During this period, he also got a building in Johannesburg, and this was a little building for his in-laws, my grandparents, my mother's parents, who very interestingly, when my mother was going to marry him, said, marry him? This man's never going to amount to anything. Ah, how wrong they were. But they wouldn't allow him to put a lift in to this light industrial building, which of course meant it was always, they always struggled to rent it. But what is interesting is you see the influence of Hanson Tomkin and Finkelstein's 20th century building, with the brick and the disengaged columns. And my father, the council submission drawings in my father's own hand. And it's during this time that the office really starts to gain traction. Late 50s, early 60s. There are houses and there are blocks of flats, and some of which were built, this one in Claremont and this one in Belleville. And it was a period when, my father always was asked, like, how did you succeed? He, Orthodox Jewish, didn't come from a wealthy family, never really entertained anybody, but he always maintained an optimism and, of course, hard work. And I think that, I'm showing this drawing. It was a building that was not built, but I absolutely love it. I believe it was done by an architect who later worked in Malawi, Maxwell Brusso, who used to turn out these perspectives incredibly fast. I mean, this one doesn't even have windows drawn, but this is what the office was able to do. And I remember this as a child. My father used to, in the office, just turn to the likes of, that incredible core of designers who were around him, architects at the time, Billy Morris, Colin Cleveland, Cecil Potley, and say, chaps, my house tonight. And everybody arrived and they worked and they drew and drank a lot of beer. I used to keep refilling the beer mugs and emptying the ashtrays. And one of the most beautiful buildings, I think, to come out of that period is Albion Mill, 60 flats from 1969. I think what makes it incredibly powerful are these slightly kinked balconies. And of course, Ecklenburg in Rondebosch with the slightly Carnian towers. And I think the other thing that enabled my father to succeed was this constant optimism. And I was recommended by Matthew Krauss to read Joseph Sherman's translation of Yiddish stories in South Africa. And they're all quite dark. There's always this notion of a finstere Medina, a dark country, as opposed to the golden Medina, the golden country. And that's what my father was aiming for. And the one thing in terms of philosophy during this period, I mean, as I said, there was a lot of Harry Belafonte, but there was also this record, You Don't Have to Be Jewish. And it was about the American Jews making it suddenly. And there's one story, there's one track on this, and I'll tell the joke very quickly and how it relates to architecture. And that was this well-to-do Jew has bought a yacht, he's in his captain's uniform, and he turns to his old immigrant mother and he says, Mama, don't I look fantastic? I'm the captain. And his old mother looks at him and she says, my son, by your father, you're a captain. By your mother, you're a captain. But by a captain, you're no captain. And I always remember when my father encountered poor quality consultants, be they structural engineers or quantity surveyors, he would then tell the story and turn to the quantity surveyor and say, by a quantity surveyor, you're no quantity surveyor. It didn't always go down well, but it made the point. The other thing I always remember is in 1970, my father took us to see Kelly's Heroes, which was a film about the Second World War, but was really more of a film about the 60s, the late 60s in America. And the character of Oddball, who's played by a young Donald Sutherland, has this notion that you must knock it off with the negative waves. And my father always brought us up on that you must always think positive because that's what will happen. And if you think about it, that's what happened next. Out of the blue, this job arrived. It was the old German school, and they had appointed this most wonderful Bauhausler, Piers Parr, who you see here on the left, to be the architect. But Seifritz were going to fund it. Seifritz the property department was run by David Mort. And David Mort introduced two things. One, he said, look, we've got to have Louis Karol on this. I don't know Louis Karol, but he's done a lot of blocks of flats and he's a commercially minded architect. And He brought in also an outstanding quantity surveyor, Franz Hester, and he introduced and he brought in Des Baker. Now, it's very interesting, and I think it's something that one needs to know about being Jewish in South Africa during this period. I mean, Seyfrieds weren't keen on a Jewish architect. Old man Murray or Murray and Stewart called in Des Baker and said, Des, what are we doing with a Jewish architect? Des said, I don't know, it doesn't really interest me, but he's performing. But the other thing at this point, and this is absolutely crucial, that David Mort introduced to South Africa, he introduced a negotiated contract, that this contract was not a tendered contract, the contractor was already involved. And he brought together, and onto this, he brought in Des Baker, Murray and Stewart. And there was this disparate team of this amazing Bauhausler, Piers Pahl, and a man I always loved. And I remember going out to his house in Stellenbosch in Dalzig. And the house was just permeated by this feeling of Bildung and very good coffee, which we didn't see in South Africa. And they met every Sunday night at my father's house. And it's interesting, you know, because there's always this discussion, is it a Piers Pahl building? Is it a Louis Karol building? And David Mort is quite clear about it. It's an amalgam. He says certain things came from Franz Hester, certain things came from Des Baker, and certain things came from Louis Karol and Piers Pahl. And even for the elevations, 3 sets of elevations were submitted. And what we have. And I think what's really important, and you know, it's something that my father always tried to teach me, or everyone, that you've got to design an unbugger-upable building, and a building that stands the test of time. And I believe that this building has. It still looks exquisite in the streetscape in Cape Town. And the office, as I said, continues to grow. And then something amazing happens. In 1967, we are awarded the contract to design what is now number 2 Long Street Mobile House. And for Mr. Garvin. And my father starts going to America. And here he is seen with the late, great Colin Cleveland outside Seagram's building. And this is a whole new mindset in South Africa. South African architects are not looking at France and Le Corbusier anymore. The commercial architects are looking to America. And the question is, why America? I mean, obviously, Seagram's building is absolutely sublime. Skidmore, Owens and Merrill had done Lever House, they'd done Manufacturers Trust, they'd done Pepsi Cola. But the other thing that my father saw in America was the division of labor in an office. There was going to be a design and design development department, and there was going to be production. This was based on what was then the SOM model. Certain architects at Louis Karol didn't like it and left, and others, such as people like Colin Cleveland and Billy Morris, absolutely thrived on it and produced these incredible buildings. And I think that's what my father's always looked for, is architects that you can learn from. You know, as he said, I'm not interested in the Michigas of Libeskind or Gary. I want architects that an architect like myself can learn for and make a better environment. And out of this came Mobile House, one of the very early perspectives that appeared in the newspaper, and then the building that turned out rather elegantly. And of course, no office building like this had been done in Cape Town before, and that's why it was so important to go to America and learn about the anatomy of an office building. And the other thing that I think my father saw in America was this emphasis on management in an architectural office. And it's very interesting. You know, I merged practice into Barutan Karol, and I worked with Simi Barutan. And I always remember when we were at university, Simi used to speak about management, and both students and staff looked at him with absolute incredulity that it really wasn't something worth discussing. And of course, I think as we've seen in this era of cut fees, etc., that it really is. And the other thing that was amazing about the office at that period, you know, of course, the fees were all 6%. There were no telephone calls in the morning. Everybody was in the office. And My father introduced systems like the telephone confirmation pad, the MIMO confirmation pad, so that there was a paper trail of everything. And sorry, just back to America, you can see this influence in the old lobby of Mobile House, of the Travertine and of Skidmore's, and I apologize for the poor slide. And the other thing that happened on the way back from America is that Harold Gorvey, who was the head of Tarling Trust, said to him, "So Louis, what did you learn?" And my father told him about the curtain wall. He said, "Well, fine, then make our building a curtain wall building." And I still think it is one of Cape Town's most elegant little curtain wall buildings. What's also interesting to me about this building, I was very fond and friendly with Paul Katz, who went on to become the president of Con Patterson Fox. And during the 90s, Con Patterson Fox reinvented the so-called re-entrant corner so that you'd always have two corner offices. And I'd never really noticed it before, but we were doing it in the 60s. Of course, we didn't do it on Shell House, which I'll come to. And Harold Gorvey, who commissioned this building, always held it against my father. When he moved across the road, he no longer had a corner office. And this is actually the building that sits adjacent over here now. And I just thought it's interesting to compare, even though they're 30 years apart, 20 years apart, you know, the very difference in language and how one turns a corner. Also showing the influence of America. This was our original design in 1972 for this very Mesian tower at Pier Place. But like many jobs, they disappear and then they come back. And this is the rather elegant, more symmetrical tower that has appeared in later years. And I show this drawing because I really love this drawing. I unfortunately don't know who did it in the office, but I love the bright colors. Cape Town is seen as a polychromatic city. And I think as we're moving more and more to a gray city, I really am enjoying this. And another building that emerged out of this Mesian period was, of course, Nedbank at the end of the foreshore, which took a lot of negotiation to change the language of the buildings along the foreshore from the Great Town Plan. And then in later years, we extended the building, knocking down the building next door and introducing these smoking balconies. But then an amazing thing happened, and I won't go into the entire history because it's a long story, but the highways were introduced to Cape Town. There was land appropriation. Schlesinger's promised a lovely building for the city of Cape Town, and this is what was produced, was the garden center, to get with ourselves together with Monty Sack, and this amazing perspective drawn by Cecil Potgieter, basically with every single building on Table Mountain drawn on. And for us, it was an enormous experience. We suddenly became shopping center architects. And I think there's a very important lesson here, was that neither ourselves nor Monty Sack really knew how to design a shopping center. And Manfred Moros, who was the head of Schlesinger's, said, get hold of an expert. And we turned to Beders Vicker of the Gruen Group. And of course, it was Victor Gruen who really founded the whole art of shopping center design. And he taught us how to design shopping centers, basically a simple plan. And I think it's an important lesson in terms of having expertise. And there's just a picture of Monty Sack, who was really just a very influential person in the design. And I've just included one slide from, dare I say it, the rather groovy prospectus that was produced. And there's the phrase, a place for people. And I think this is an enormously important phrase in my father's career, because it's the thread that joins Garden Center to Golden Acre and then to the work at the waterfront. And then these were the original interiors with this rather black, groovy, black Luxaflex, super graphics, and the wonderful post boxes that disappeared as you walk around them because they were mirrored. And just another shopping center that we did, just because it's a lovely example of a one-point perspective. But also because of Townsview, so the Schlesingers and their property on Townsview Estates, we were commissioned to design Shell House. And Shell House stands as this incredible monolith in the middle of town. It reads as an obelisk, and it's and still reads incredibly strongly. But just an aside, just take note here of Monty Sachs' African Life. And it's a beautiful and striking and simplistic building. And I often get asked, what was Louis Karol's greatest building? And I've now decided it is this, because Heinrich Wolff of Wolff Associates, one of South Africa's greatest architects working at the moment, Heinrich says this is our best building. So I must take Heinrich's judgment and agree with it. And just more views of this incredible verticality of the building. And rather nice model that was built of it at the time. And back to Monty Sachs' African Life across the way. And I always remember this because my father came to collect me at the airport. And even though he was driving, he said, "Do you mind if I just dictate a memo?" And while we were driving, we'd been approached by Anglo Amaprop to redo the loos in Monty Sachs' building. And my father said, "No, no, 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 no. The loos are not a good enough idea. Let us use this space here, because the building line is actually there, to push out the curtain wall. Let's use all the additional bulk that we have over here, reclad the whole building, and build a 2-story car park in the square adjacent." And it happened. And I think that was one of the secrets of the practice, was my father's ability to create work. And we were now becoming city center architects. And the next job we did was the Golden Acre, a massive building, 50 million rand, 86,000 square meters. It was the site of the old station. And what was interesting here, and again, Des Baker put together the whole team, brought Sanlam on. Again, Sanlam weren't keen on Jewish architect. Des Baker said, "No, no, 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 no. We must have Louis Karol." Wassenaar did, however, replace the engineer with his own son, his own son, Wassenaar, of Lillycrap and Wassenaar. But what to me is incredibly important about this job, and it's this diagram, and this is why I believe the Golden Acre is still successful in Cape Town. It's because of its permeability. It's not an enclosed space. It wasn't a traditional Victor Gouron shopping center that is enclosed on all the sides. We did have that problem of along Strand Street, but we had the connections into the city, into Adderley Street, into the station. And that to me is very important. And there was, of course, this great public space that occurred in the middle and became a new urban square for Cape Town. And, you know, looking at that question of the Strand Street, this was a scheme which we did in later years, led by Justin Snell, to put on a new top to the building, change it to flats, the roof, which would have been a call center, and to build a walkway down Parliament Street. But unfortunately, nothing ever happened. But that sometimes happens with projects. Another high-rise that we did, this was to be the new library for the city of Cape Town in the Mayoral Gardens behind the City Hall. But what did happen that year, in 1970, we won our very first bronze medal from the Institute of Architects, which was an incredible feat for what was known as a commercial office in those days. And I show this photograph. This is obviously my father, but it's got a very young series of architects who I think are all deceased now. Harvey Fagan, Hal Kent, Mike Munich as president of the Institute, and Gilbert Calais. And it was the beginning of a glory period in town. We did a second building for Mobil Oil, Mobil Court, all in granite. We redesigned Protea Place. And I think that this job here, this elevation, is symptomatic of the, to use a quotation of Mao, that to a certain extent within the office, we let 100 flowers blossom and 1,000 schools of thought contend. And that style was never that important. It was an attitude towards building. And, you know, I can honestly say that originally there was going to be a rather rationalist facade here. And I was the one who introduced this more classical approach. And I think it turned out beautifully. So over that period, we built a whole series of towers and buildings in town. We also designed the Gardens Commercial School, for which we won a medal. Interestingly, they only came to us because my father had spoken at a conference about fast tracking, and the head of public works came to him and said, well, if you can fast track things, do this scheme. And what was interesting about this, they originally were going to demolish these lovely little Victorian houses. And my father was very fond of them because he had this thing, after he dropped us at school at Herzliya High, further up in Highlands Estate, he'd get his chauffeur to drop him at the top of the gardens, and he'd walk down, sometimes to the end of the garden, sometimes all the way to his office. But he said he needed this time to think, to clear his mind, and to fantasize about what projects he could generate next. And we also did 2 little buildings in Claremont. This one, unfortunately, is rather elegant little townhouses, which have been demolished. And this building in Claremont, which unfortunately has not survived my father's dictum of that building should be unbugger-uppable, because this building certainly does not look anything like the ziggurat it originally looked like. And then we had a foray into Johannesburg, and this was the original Goldfields building. And a young architect from America joined us, Yvonne Ellison Smuts. And my father said to her, what would you do? And this is what she did. And my father tore up the original designs, and we built this. Just as an aside, if you wonder how big the panels of granite are, during that stage, my father used to take Pancho Geddes for dinner at the Kosher Hotel, the Connoisseur on the edge of Dormfontein. He said to Pancho, Pancho, how big should the panels be? And Pancho said, the height of 2 tombstones, which is what they are, evidently. And Yvonne then went on to do this rather spectacular tower in Cape Town. But in Johannesburg, we also preserved the little building from HL&H, even though back to Pancho again. Pancho always said that he was sure at some point the big black building was going to eat the little Victorian building, but unfortunately it never happened. And we also did the brick building next door, the LTA headquarters. And then we designed, in later years, in the 1990s, in 1994, we designed the Sandton Convention Center. But what's more important is the story about the building next door. Wolf Sessman, who was the head of Liberty Properties and who liked to sweat an asset, turned to my father and he said, Louis, what are we going to do with a piece of land next door? My father said, Wolfie, there's the World Cup coming up. Why don't we put a hotel there? And Wolfie said, no, that's 7 months' time. But what actually happened is Wolfie gave the go-ahead. We started designing. 3 weeks later, we had permission to start excavating the basement. And 7 months later, we opened a 120-room holiday inn. And that was part of the greatness of the office, was this ability to work at speed. And in addition to Johannesburg, we had a foray in Israel. We unfortunately were designing a 600-room Sheraton, which unfortunately the developer went bankrupt for $25 million in the diamond crash. So we never built it. You can see, for those of you that know Musenberg and the new pavilion there, will see that the influence of Graham Parker in both of these buildings. But then we went on to do some serious buildings like Bet HaMagen, very detailed, very in granite, very much a grid. But at the same time, in later years, while I was working in the Israel office, we went down a more, shall I say, neoclassical route. And for those of you that are Lutyens fans, you'll notice that this is an exact replica of the floor at the Durbar Hall at the Viceroy's house in New Delhi. The other thing that always makes me slightly happy about this building is it was publicly criticized by Daniel Libeskind, who built the building across the road, as being bad Gothic. I've never seen it as Gothic, but at least I was noticed by Libeskind. And in the later years, back in Cape Town, and I must show a picture of this man because this is Dave Jack, who was a most exceptional client, enlightened, And obviously I don't have the time to go through the whole history of the waterfront and the story of the waterfront, but basically we were appointed to, well, my father was appointed, I think at 5,000 Rand, to be the retail consultant. As he said, we never got paid the 5,000 Rand, but we did go on to build hundreds of thousands of square feet of buildings. And what was important about the shopping center is my father felt that there was no regional shopping center close to the Schmaltz belt in Sea Point and Clifton and Camps Bay. All those people had to drive to Cavendish, build the big magnet here, and we will catch them. And it's certainly been very successful and has gone through numerous variants of expansion. One of the very early drawings, which I think was either drawn by Colin Cleveland or Paolo Viotti. And also at the waterfront, we started to develop this language of a very restrained classicism. This was BOE, which we then took further at the headquarters of Liberty Life in Durban. And during this period, you know, for all of those of you who have been architects for a little bit longer, you know that architecture is a series of peaks and troughs, booms and recessions. And during the one recession, we started to do outsourcing in England. And it was a very, very successful experience. And it also, we found, raised our technological and detailing game. You could no longer be dependent on one of the architects from the office going down to site and correcting the mistakes that were necessarily overlooked on the drawing. Everything had to be right when it was sent north. And these buildings were done by Caesar WG, and this one by Piers Goff, who we later brought out for, I think, our 55th anniversary. And then we've had we've gone further north up into Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think, you know, though, for those of us in Cape Town, we often struggle to remember that we're part of Africa, but we are. So I say Sub-Saharan rather than Africa. And this is a burnt out building on the Cairo Road Society House in Lusaka in Zambia, very much done under the hand of Robert Silk, who was one of the young partners at that stage. We built in Mauritius, and we were busy building also in Cote d'Ivoire. And this, unfortunately, was my very first experience with COVID, in that my client, Mamadi Dion, calls me one day, sounding terrible, but he says, "Don't worry, I'm going home from hospital." Calls me the next day from hospital, we discuss the project, and the next day he was dead, and the first person I knew to die of COVID. And I shall say this about my father, in that, you know, his response was always, "Why do these things happen to me just when we were going to build this lovely project in Abidjan?" And what's also interesting is that there's some projects which come back years later. This was a building we were doing, which was originally Eco 1 and Eco 2, then became Alvanti, and that was from 2011. And what's very interesting, it's come back to us now to Eitan Karol, and it is being reimagined under the hands of David Eitan, our design director. And I think coming back to Cape Town, you know, was very interesting at the end of my father's life in Cape Town was the changing and reimagining of buildings that we had done originally, usually as offices, as blocks of flats. And this was 22 Long Street, which was then re-envisaged as a block of flats with additional floors. But just to add this, because this was the very original, before we actually got the job for 22 Long Street, we had it as White House, as a very, very different building. But the building, and really the last building my father worked on in the office, was one on Albert, which had a special place in his heart because it was a block of flats, it was housing on the main road. And it was something that always obsessed my father, that the main road should become a stronger and stronger hub. It's got the railway line, which is the infrastructure. It's got used to have a very good bus service. Increase the density on the main road and make it happen. Also, and you can only just see here, which is where the Kulenberg goods yards used to be, the lovely building by Brian Manser. My father, it was one of his obsessions was that the Kulenberg yard should be released to be social housing, because he felt it would give housing of an affordable nature close to the city and would help tie back Woodstock, Salt River, Town, and District 6. And I'm going to show a final slide. And I think this is the important thing. This is my father on the left, obviously, is a very young architect, always hands-on. And this is a photograph on the right taken by Simi Parutanov, his brother David, and my father discussing this building here, the Jalingo Water Tower. And it's the very last time my father came into the office, into the studio. And what it is, it's him drawing, touching lightly on David's aesthetics, but most particularly on the planning to see that the building worked. And that to me epitomizes his career. I was going to end with this quotation, which is from Charles Holden in 1937 and the subject of my PhD. So this was the quotation I was thinking about. I prefer to say it in stone or in bricks and mortar or in any other building material. I still feel that it is the only language worthwhile. For what I say now doesn't matter half as much as what the building itself has to say to you and the generations to come. So I read this quotation to my number 2 daughter, Ellie, who's in the practice in business development. And she said to me, nonsense. Zada would never have used that quotation. He never would have quoted Holden. So I thought about that and I found another quotation, which I think is a better quotation. And it goes back to my second slide, my third slide, and it pays homage to everybody who, together with my father, helped create this amazing firm. And I know their names I haven't mentioned. A name that obviously leaps out is Les Vides, who ran the incredible structural department. So in 1993, my father is interviewed by Hayden Ellis for that wonderful, wonderful magazine, ADA. And Hayden asked my father this question. He said, what do you attribute your success to? And my father replied, undoubtedly, the wonderful people in our office. They are talented and receptive to motivation. We have welded the experienced talent of the partners and associates to the freshness of the talent of the young people who recognize the value of maturity of design and technical know-how. I am forever grateful to all my colleagues and salute them. And I think my daughter Ellie is right. That really is probably more my father quotation. And my father, a most incredible man, a father, an architect, a grandfather, a great-grandfather. He died on July 18th, which of course is our former president Nelson Mandela's birthday. It was the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av, a major fast day and a very auspicious day to die. He died in a house he had designed next to his wife of 67 years and with his son and daughter next to him. He was buried later that day in his beloved Musenberg on a beautiful windless day, very rare in Musenberg, across the road from Marina de Gama, designed by Dave Jack and Lindsay Falk. And he was buried in sight of the mountains, his beloved mountains, and where you can smell the Luft, that fantastic air that expresses the atmosphere of Musenberg. And thank you very much. May his memory be a blessing to us all. Thank you. And I came in almost in time.
Thank you very much on behalf of the School of Architecture at the University of Cape Town for a very beautiful lecture. To conclude proceedings, I'm going to hand over to Heidi Boulanger. So from us, thanks very much, Eitan. Heidi, over to you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you for sharing this incredible legacy. I mean, I don't think it's, what did you want to call the lecture initially? The man who built Cape Town.
Yes, you know, which was I think a headline in the newspaper at one point.
I mean, I think it's absolutely a suitable headline. What an incredible career. Thank you so much for Sonia for suggesting this lecture and putting me in touch as well. Yeah, incredible. I just wanted to know, is there any questions? We have a few minutes. I know many of you have places to be, but are there any questions from the floor?
I obviously absolutely exhausted everybody. You know, it always makes me think of the you know, the lectures when Michael Graves and Bob Stern used to come out and speak for 3.5, 4 hours in Cape Town. But I don't think one can do that anymore.
No, I think in the era of Zoom, everyone has a bit of Zoom fatigue, but what an incredible legacy.
Can I ask a question, Eitan?
Yes.
Interesting about the idea of the work continuing at night, you know, with people coming over and doing that. Do you think that architecture is the poorer for the fact that these days we, you know, our teams do expect to have a home life in some ways? And so as office owners, our ability to get the team over to the house with the lure of beers and cigarettes is not that attractive anymore.
Well, I think that two things have happened. I think that architectural salaries relative to earning, the cost of living has gone down. You know, and I always quote the example of the Span houses in Blackheath in England, is that when Span was built, it was 4 times an architect's salary to build, to buy a house. It's now 16 times an architect's salary, and the area hasn't changed that significantly. But you know, I've been watching this whole thing in the RIBA, and I don't know if Simi is on the call. I can't see him, but you know, it's one of the things that Simi and David have always done, coming out of having worked for major practices in the UK and the US, is that Simi said there is to be no overtime unless it's asked for and paid for. And I think it's a very difficult balance. I mean, when I worked at Caesar Pelli, chaps used to stay after work to enter competitions in their own time. If they'd done a good job, they'd bring it to Caesar and say, Caesar, what do you think? And Caesar would say, good, terrific. We'll take it on and do it in our name. And that was part of the learning experience. I mean, I stayed late at nights at Caesar to work on other projects I wasn't working on or to help people. But I think you're absolutely right. It's a very difficult thing to get that balance. But there's also the question, you know, Bannister Fletcher's son was also Fletcher, H.M. Fletcher. Fletcher always said that to succeed as an architect, you can only have one mistress, and that must be architecture. And maybe, let's face it, you've got to have that 24-hour commitment. And I think the thing that saved my father there was the 25 hours of Shabbat, that, as was said in Cape Town in the 70s, even Des Baker couldn't get hold of Louis Karol. And I think that that is an enormously important thing, that he always had that balance of 25 hours with the family and this little 6-year-old me schlepping behind him, wanting to come to site meetings. But it is, and I think you're right. I think it's a very difficult balance. And I think in a way, Simi is right, that overtime has to be asked for and paid for. But you don't get to produce buildings overnight.
Okay, I think, are there any other questions before we end off for today? Nothing from the floor. Okay, well, Eitan, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing Louis' life and legacy. And I mean, you know, his tribute is in the city and hopefully will be there for generations. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak at UCT.
And just from my side, this is our last school talk for the year. So we'll be sharing hopefully next year's calendar before the academic year starts. But thanks for everyone for joining for all the talks this year. And I think it's wonderful to end off on a high note. So yeah, have a wonderful evening, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eitan. Okay, I'm going to end the meeting. Bye.